I'm Alex, and in today's video, we show what happens when inexperienced climbers try climbing Everest. From a climber whose impatience and entitlement pushes her to make a single unclipped decision, to one's habit of stopping mid-route to debate her guides reaches a breaking point. It was May 21st, 2018, on Everest's summit ridge at 28,500 feet, deep in the death zone where humans can survive only hours. Temperatures hit minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, oxygen dropped to 30% of sea level, and the exposed ridge left no room for error. Every step demanded precise energy and oxygen management, and even small mistakes could be fatal. Karen Dolev, 42, worked as a marketing executive for a Fortune 500 company in Dallas. She had built her career on exceeding targets and refusing to accept limits, and she brought that same mindset to Everest. Her climbing resume included Denali and Aconcagua, but she had never spent extended periods above 25,000 feet, where the human body deteriorates quickly, regardless of fitness. She approached the expedition like a professional objective, measurable, attainable, and under her control, but the mountain operates on a different rule set. You can't negotiate with the altitude. It doesn't care how determined you are. The summit ridge is one of the most dangerous parts of the entire climb. Even with supplemental oxygen, climbers must adhere to strict turnaround times, usually between noon and 2 p.m., to allow for safe descent. Guides enforce these rules because the margin for error is minuscule. Afternoon conditions often deteriorate rapidly, winds increase, and visibility drops. Karen had been moving aggressively throughout the ascent, consuming oxygen at a higher than average rate. She was still 400 vertical feet below the summit, already behind the schedule that would have ensured survival. At this point, I could tell that pushing forward was becoming more than just risky. It was straight up life-threatening. When her guide ordered the turnaround, she refused. Karen argued that she was close enough to the summit to continue safely, pointing to other climbers still ascending. She treated the instructions as suggestions rather than life-saving rules. Her oxygen supply was insufficient for both the ascent and a safe descent, but she dismissed the calculations. It's hard not to see this as classic summit fever. The investment, the ego, the mindset that success outweighs survival. Against explicit warnings, she pressed on. By early afternoon, the weather turned faster than forecasted. Winds exceeded 40 miles per hour, snow drove horizontally, and visibility dropped to less than 20 feet. Her oxygen supply reached critically low levels, forcing her to ration what little remained. Reduced oxygen combined with extreme exertion slowed her movement and impaired coordination. Every step required focus she could no longer fully summon. Watching a climber like this, you realize that determination alone can't replace oxygen or timing. It becomes cruelly obvious how fragile the human body is up here. Approximately 200 feet below the summit, Karen's supplemental oxygen was effectively gone. She relied solely on the ambient air, which cannot sustain life at this altitude for long. Hypoxia set in quickly. Confusion, poor balance, and impaired judgment made steady movement impossible. Cold exposure accelerated hypothermia, and she collapsed repeatedly along the ridge. It's a harsh reality. At this height, the environment will win if you ignore the rules. Survival isn't negotiable. Other climbers nearby were also fighting for survival and could not provide meaningful help. Rescue was impossible given the extreme wind, low temperatures, and exposure on the ridge. Karen became stranded, and her body slowly shut down under the combined effects of hypoxia and hypothermia. It's sobering to think how quickly the situation escalates. The summit seems so close, yet the death zone doesn't forgive hesitation or defiance. Despite desperate attempts by nearby climbers to offer support, she never regained consciousness. Her body succumbed to oxygen deprivation and extreme cold. Recovery was only possible later in the season, when conditions allowed safe access. The expedition's medical officer ruled the cause of death as hypoxia complicated by severe hypothermia, with contributing factors including refusal to follow turnaround times and mismanagement of oxygen. The incident was documented in climbing summaries as a reminder of the deadly consequences of ignoring protocols in the death zone. Karen's drive to reach the summit, the same force that fueled her professional achievements, had prevented her from recognizing when retreat was the only way to survive. At that altitude, ambition and determination don't change the outcome. The conditions don't adjust to the climber, and exceeding physical limits at that altitude leads to rapid decline. It was May 17th, 2016, on the south col of Mount Everest, a wind-stripped saddle at 26,000 feet, where the temperature that evening was falling below -20. The thin air doesn't announce what it's doing to a person. It just quietly disassembles them from the inside out. And by the time the symptoms are visible to anyone watching, it is already too late. Laurie Vanden was 41 and worked as a regional sales director for a pharmaceutical distribution company based in Phoenix, Arizona. She had completed several Himalayan trekking expeditions over 4 years and had summited 2 peaks above 20,000 feet through commercial, guided programs. Her Everest permit had cost roughly $65,000, a figure she referenced often enough that other expedition members later told investigators they knew the number before they knew her name. She had joined a commercial guiding operation out of Kathmandu and arrived at base camp in early April with gear that was mostly still tagged on arrival. She had no prior experience above 24,000 feet and had never spent a night in the death zone. Her lead guide had flagged concerns about her acclimatization pace to FETA operations staff during the rotation weeks. She pushed back on rest days repeatedly. Other team members described her as someone who treated the mountain the way she treated quarterly targets, as a problem to be solved through force of will, not biology. By 6:30 p.m., wind gusts were reaching 40 miles per hour across the col, and the temperature had dropped sharply since late afternoon. Most climbers had retreated to their tents for rest before the planned pre-dawn summit push. Laurie had not. Witnesses told investigators she had been moving between tents for roughly an hour, verbally expressing dissatisfaction with her tent assignment, cursing at her guide, and the pace of logistical preparations on a mountain where pace is dictated by survival, not preference. Eric Valois later described seeing Laurie pacing near the edge of Camp 4 around 7:40 p.m., already on supplemental oxygen, but repeatedly pulling her mask off to argue, exposing herself to air that barely sustained consciousness, let alone physical exertion. Each removal made her breathing faster and shallower. Eric said he called out to her twice. She did not respond to either call. I personally think the first time she pulled that mask off to make a point, it significantly worsened her hypoxic state and reduced her chances of recovery. Tashi, the Sherpa guide assigned to the expedition, saw her attempt to walk unassisted toward the fixed rope line. Her movements had gone erratic. She planted her trekking pole at the wrong angle and stumbled sideways, overcorrecting with her upper body. Her speech had deteriorated into fragmented sounds that Tashi later described as words that didn't connect into anything he could follow. Within 2 minutes, she dropped to her knees. Eric, watching from roughly 30 feet away, noted her hands clawing at the snow. Not deliberately, but reflexively, the way a body reaches for something solid when it no longer trusts itself. She attempted to stand twice. Both times her legs failed to coordinate beneath her. Then her arms began jerking in irregular, poorly coordinated movements, consistent with severe neurological impairment. The oxygen mask had slipped off again and hung from its strap against her shoulder. In the headlamp beam, Eric described her face as dark and mottled, the color leaving it unevenly. A thin line of saliva had frozen at the corner of her mouth. She continued to move without coordinated control. No cry, no call, just the wind in her limbs moving against the snow. Doria reached her in roughly 90 seconds and attempted to reseat the mask and hold it against her face, but she was already unresponsive. Her breathing came in shallow, irregular intervals, each one further apart than the last, difficult to detect in the wind. She fell forward, face first into the snow, still gripping her trekking pole so tightly that her knuckles remained locked around the grip. As she stopped moving entirely, she was already dead. The post-expedition medical review identified the cause of death as high-altitude cerebral edema with concurrent high-altitude pulmonary edema, brain swelling and fluid accumulation in the lungs, progressing simultaneously in an environment where intervention was not possible. Her family filed a formal complaint against the guiding company in the months that followed, citing inadequate supervision. The lead guide provided documentation of 3 separate written advisories issued to Laurie during the expedition, each recommending she halt or delay progression. The complaint was not upheld. I can look at every piece of documented evidence in this case and reach only one conclusion. The guides did their job. What they could not do was make her listen. It was May 18, 2016, on the upper slopes of Mount Everest, along the South Col route at around 25,000 feet. Above that point was the death zone, where the human body can only function for a limited time. Climbers move through it, knowing that delays aren't just inconvenient, they can become dangerous very quickly. Alina Vorsk, 41, worked in luxury real estate in Naples. She was used to controlling schedules and getting results on her own terms. She had climbed Mount Rainier and Denali, but nothing at this altitude. She joined a commercial expedition expecting structure and support, but not necessarily the level of discipline required. From the way this starts, it feels like she approached Everest as something she could manage, not something that would push back. The route above Camp 4 was made up of steep ice slopes with fixed ropes. Temperatures stayed around -20 degrees Fahrenheit, and winds were expected to increase later in the day. At that elevation, oxygen levels dropped to about 30% of sea level, making every step harder. Most teams leave before dawn to avoid deteriorating weather later on. Her expedition leader set a 1 a.m. departure time. That's standard, but Alina refused. She didn't want to start that early and pushed for a daylight climb instead. She eventually left around 6 a.m., about 5 hours behind the main group. That delay doesn't just put you behind schedule, it puts you in a completely different version of the mountain. As she moved higher, she began encountering climbers already descending from the summit. That meant stopping frequently, stepping aside, and waiting for others to pass. At that altitude, every stop takes effort to recover from. Breathing becomes more labored, and it's harder to regain momentum. Those pauses may not seem like much, but up there, they add up faster than people expect. By late morning, winds on Mount Everest reached 35 miles per hour. Blowing snow reduced visibility to under 30 feet, and the route became difficult to follow. At 25,500 feet, she paused on a narrow traverse, but stiff hands and hardened ice left little margin for error. Attempting to clip into the next anchor, her crampon caught, she fell sideways, and while the rope stopped her from falling down the mountain, it swung her into the slope, causing multiple rib fractures and serious head trauma. She was left suspended, unable to stabilize herself. At that point, it's not just about technique anymore. It comes down to whether your body can respond, and hers was already under too much stress. She couldn't regain proper footing, her movements slowed, and her coordination dropped. The cold continued to affect her. Her body was losing heat, and her ability to react was fading. You can see how everything starts stacking here. Fatigue, cold, and now injury. None of it is immediate on its own, but together it becomes overwhelming. Other climbers were nearby, but they were also slowed by congestion and worsening conditions. It took time for anyone to reach her, and at that altitude, time is limited. She remained in that position for over an hour. During that time, her condition continued to decline. The exposure, combined with her injuries, made recovery unlikely. Without movement or proper shelter, her body couldn't keep up with the stress. Her guides eventually reached her and tried to stabilize the situation. But moving an injured climber at that altitude, in those conditions, is extremely slow. Winds continued to increase and visibility remained low. Even with help, there's only so much anyone can do up there. The mountain sets the pace, not the people. By the time they secured her, she had already lost consciousness. She did not respond after that point. Her body was recovered 3 days later, once conditions improved enough for a safe retrieval. The cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma, with severe hypothermia as a contributing factor. Delayed timing, prolonged exposure, and exhaustion were also noted. Looking at how it unfolded, it all traces back to that early decision. Starting late didn't seem critical at the time, but up there, small choices don't stay small for long. It was July 3rd, 2015, and the afternoon sun beat down on K2 base camp at 16,400 feet, casting long shadows across the Godwin-Austen Glacier. The camp sat on a rocky moraine over restless ice, tents pitched on debris, stable enough to trust, but never forget. Far below, the approach from Concordia and the Baltoro felt impossibly distant, underscoring just how isolated the valley was. Above it all, K2 rose 12,000 vertical feet in a single sweep of rock, ice, and cloud, hemmed in by Karakoram peaks that stole light early and returned it late. Wind here was harsher than Everest's, unpredictable, violent, and funneled through narrow valleys that made forecasts feel like educated guesses. Temperatures hovered near freezing even in direct sun, cold enough that climbers moved between tents and insulated jackets. Prayer flags snapped in the wind, their color sharp against stone and ice. A generator droned from the mess tent, while radios crackled with route updates and weather fragments that never sounded reassuring. About 40 climbers occupied base camp across 6 teams, quiet compared to Everest, but heavy with intent. July had only just begun. Camps were still being adjusted, ropes still being fixed higher up, and everyone knew the margin for error on K2 would only narrow from here. Among those preparing for a possible early summit window was Marcus Brennan, a 46-year-old from Greenwich, Connecticut, who had made his fortune managing a hedge fund that specialized in distressed assets. He had sold the company in 2013 for $340 million, walked away from finance entirely, and turned his attention toward what he described as legacy pursuits. Mountaineering had become the centerpiece of that transition. He had summited Everest twice, once in 2013 via the South Col route, again in 2014 via the same route with better weather. And both ascents had been documented extensively on his social media channels, where he maintained a following of 18,000 people who tracked his expeditions. K2 represented the next logical step. Everest had been a test of endurance and willpower, but K2 carried a mystique that Everest no longer possessed. It was steeper, more technical, more dangerous, and far less commercialized. Summiting K2 would place Marcus among a smaller group of climbers who had stood atop both peaks, a distinction that mattered deeply to someone who measured achievement through exclusive accomplishments. He had paid $120,000 to join a small expedition led by a Pakistani guide named Rashid Khan, a sum that exceeded the typical $70,000 to $80,000, cost by enough to raise eyebrows among other expedition leaders at base camp. Marcus's original high-altitude support withdrew 2 weeks before departure after hearing about his expectations. Word spread quickly, and experienced climbers began turning him down, regardless of pay. He arrived in Pakistan without dedicated support until Rashid found a replacement through Nepali contacts. Like most K2 expeditions, the team relied on Pakistani porters for lower camps and a small number of Nepali guides for one-on-one support higher up. Cheering Dorje arrived at K2 base camp on June 28th, 5 days before Marcus. He was 39 years old, originally from the Rolwalling Valley in Nepal, and had spent 17 years working as a high-altitude guide. His resume included 8 Everest summits and 2 K2 summits, the first in 2011 and the second in 2013. He was known within the Nepali guiding community as conservative with turnaround times and uncompromising on safety protocols, reliable qualities that kept him alive, but occasionally cost him work with clients who believed money could erase risk. He supported a wife, 3 children, and elderly parents whose medical expenses consumed a significant portion of his income. Cheering took the job for one reason: money. His 7-year-old daughter needed heart surgery that would cost $22,000, far more than he had saved in years of climbing. When Rashid offered $18,000 plus a $10,000 summit bonus, Cheering knew the terms signaled danger. He accepted anyway. The situation left him no alternative. Marcus and Cheering met in the mess tent on July 3rd, as Rashid outlined the expedition plan. Marcus was blunt about his expectations. He had paid premium rates to guarantee a summit and expected that goal to take precedence over standard protocols. Turnaround times, weather limits, and conservative margins were described as problems money was meant to solve. And Cheering replied that his responsibility was to support the climb while protecting both their lives. Marcus made his position clear. Safety only mattered as long as it didn't interfere with reaching the top. The expedition included 4 other clients, all of whom had previous high-altitude experience and required less intensive support. Rashid assigned Cheering to focus exclusively on Marcus, a decision that made logistical sense given Marcus's limited technical skills and evident expectation of personalized service. Over the following days, other expedition members began noting Marcus's behavior toward Cheering, the way he issued instructions rather than making requests, the casual dismissiveness when Cheering offered suggestions, the pattern of treating him as hired labor rather than an experienced guide whose judgment might be worth considering. During the first acclimatization meeting, when Rashid explained the route structure and timing, Marcus interrupted multiple times to ask whether exceptions could be made to standard procedures. He wanted to know if they could skip certain camps, accelerate the rotation schedule, or carry extra oxygen to compensate for his slower pace. Rashid explained patiently that acclimatization couldn't be purchased or accelerated, that the body required time at specific altitudes to adapt, and that rushing the process could trigger pulmonary or cerebral edema. Marcus accepted this with visible reluctance, making clear through his questions and body language that he viewed the timeline as an inconvenience rather than a necessity. The first rotation began on July 5th, when teams started moving loads to Camp 1 at approximately 20,000 feet. The route from base camp climbed steep scree and ice slopes for roughly 3,600 vertical feet, gaining altitude quickly enough that even acclimatized climbers felt the thin air. Marcus struggled more than expected. His pace was slow, his breathing labored, and he required frequent rest stops on terrain that experienced climbers covered steadily. Cheering noted the difficulty, but said nothing, understanding that early rotations often revealed a climber's true capacity and that first-week suffering didn't always predict later failure. At Camp 1, Marcus demanded that Chiring carry his camera equipment during the next rotation, a professional DSLR with 2 lenses that added nearly 4 pounds to the load. Chiring was already managing alongside safety gear and emergency supplies. When Chiring explained the difference between group equipment and personal extras, Marcus reminded him of the premium payment and implied that exclusive service was exactly what that payment had purchased. Chiring agreed without further objection, recognizing that arguing rarely changed outcomes and often jeopardized what families back home were depending on. The second rotation to Camp 2, around 22,000 feet, exposed deeper problems. Marcus developed a persistent headache and nausea, early signs that his body was struggling to adapt. Chiring recommended an extra rest day to improve acclimatization. Marcus refused, insisting the weather wouldn't wait. His oxygen saturation measured 74% at rest, low, but not enough to force a decision he didn't want to make. By the third rotation to Camp 3, around 23,900 feet, Chiring was openly concerned. The fixed rope terrain demanded constant focus, and Marcus was clearly failing to keep up, stopping every few dozen steps, breathing hard, fumbling routine tasks that should have been automatic. At Camp 3, his oxygen saturation dropped to 69%. Chiring urged an immediate descent for more acclimatization. Marcus refused, dismissing the warning by pointing out that others had climbed higher with similar numbers. On July 18th, between rotations at base camp, Marcus pulled Chiring aside with an offer, an extra $5,000 paid in cash, in exchange for a guarantee that they would not turn back before the summit, no matter the conditions or the hour. Marcus said he understood turnaround times, but he hadn't spent 18 months training and $120,000 to stop short. He wanted commitment to keep climbing until they summited or physically couldn't move. Chiring's response was immediate and uncomfortable. Turnaround times existed specifically to prevent the scenario Marcus was proposing, continuing past the point of safe descent, gambling on summit success while exhaustion and darkness accumulated. K2's weather windows were narrower and less predictable than Everest's, and the descent from the summit was technically harder and more dangerous than the ascent. Abandoning turnaround protocols meant accepting a significantly higher probability of death. Marcus's counter-argument focused on value and compensation. He was offering $28,000 total for a single expedition, far beyond standard rates. That premium existed specifically to purchase commitment beyond normal limits. If Chiring wasn't willing to provide that level of service, Marcus would find someone who was. The statement wasn't delivered as a threat, but as a simple observation about markets and replacements, as if human judgment could be swapped out the way gear could. Chiring spent that evening calculating exactly how much money he had saved for his daughter's surgery, and how much remained needed. The gap was $4,000. The bonus Marcus offered would close that gap completely, fund the procedure, and leave enough remaining for follow-up care and medication. He made the decision with full awareness of what he was accepting, that he would be tied to a client who wanted obedience, not guidance, and who believed protocols were negotiable if the price was right. He accepted Marcus's terms the following morning, without expressing the doubts that had kept him awake most of the night. On July 21st, forecasts hinted at a narrow summit window, high pressure expected around July 23rd, possibly holding for 2 days. On K2, that was both a promise and a gamble. Teams rushed final preparations, checking oxygen and reviewing route conditions with the rope-fixing crews. Rashid laid out the plan: leave base camp on the 22nd, reach Camp 4 on the 23rd, start the summit push at 11 p.m., aim for dawn on the 24th, and descend before conditions turned. Marcus attended the briefing, but spent much of it checking his phone and reviewing his own equipment checklist. When Rashid emphasized the importance of turning around by 2 p.m., regardless of position, Marcus nodded without comment. Chairing watched this interaction and understood that Marcus had no intention of following the turnaround protocol, that their earlier agreement had established terms that superseded anything Rashid said in a group tent. The push toward the summit began on July 22nd, when teams started moving up through the established camps. Marcus and Cheering climbed steadily through Camp 1 and Camp 2, reaching Camp 3 by early afternoon. They spent 4 hours resting, forcing down food and liquids despite the altitude's appetite-suppressing effects, then continued upward to Camp 4 at approximately 26,000 feet, the threshold of the death zone where the human body began deteriorating faster than it could recover. Camp 4 on K2 was barely a camp at all, just narrow shelves hacked into exposed snow and ice below the summit pyramid, tents anchored with buried gear and whatever rock could be found. Spindrift poured through constantly, icing zippers and filling vestibules, while temperatures stayed well below zero, and wind could turn dangerous without warning. Marcus arrived around 7 p.m. on July 23rd, visibly spent, moving slowly, speaking with a slight slur, his eyes unfocused in the way that signaled advancing hypoxia. Chiring checked Marcus's oxygen saturation while Marcus rested in his sleeping bag. The reading showed 62%. At sea level, 62% would prompt immediate hospitalization. At 26,000 feet, it represented severe hypoxia and a sharply increased risk of cerebral or pulmonary edema. Chiring explained that the number suggested Marcus wasn't adapting well enough to continue higher safely, that the condition would likely deteriorate as they climbed into thinner air, and that descending now would allow another attempt in a future season when his body might respond better. Marcus's response was immediate and non-negotiable. He reminded Cheering of the arrangement, of the payment that existed specifically to ensure they reached the summit, regardless of complications. He pointed out that he had summited Everest twice with similar numbers, that pulse oximeters were guidelines rather than absolute limits, and that plenty of climbers had succeeded despite worse symptoms. He was continuing, and Waring's choice was to accompany him, as agreed, or breach the contract and forfeit the bonus. The summit push began at 11 p.m. on July 23rd, when teams started leaving Camp 4 under a clear sky dense with stars. Unlike many climbers on K2, Marcus was climbing with supplemental oxygen, but he treated it as a resource to be rationed rather than a lifeline. The flow was kept conservative to stretch cylinders, and when the regulator iced, the mask seals stiffened and leaked at the edges. During rests, Marcus repeatedly pulled the mask down to clear condensation and break up ice around the valve, a habit that dropped his saturation further and made every restart harder. The initial route followed a broad snow slope that steepened gradually, requiring front pointing with crampons and rhythmic breathing that matched each step. Marcus moved slowly from the start, stopping every 15 to 20 steps to rest while other teams passed where the terrain allowed. His breathing produced a rasping sound even through the mask, and his headlamp beam wavered as his head drooped between efforts. By 3 a.m., roughly 4 hours into the climb, they reached the base of the bottleneck at approximately 27,200 feet. The bottleneck was a steep couloir of blue ice angled between 45 and 50 degrees, roughly 600 feet tall, squeezed beneath a massive hanging serac, an overhanging tower of ice that could collapse without warning and sweep the gully clean. Fixed ropes allowed climbers to ascend using ascenders, but the exposure was total, and the objective hazard meant time spent directly beneath. That serac was time borrowed from luck. Strong climbers crossed the bottleneck in 40 to 50 minutes. Marcus required 2.5 hours. Marcus's pace through the bottleneck was agonizing. He stopped every few steps, leaning into the ice and hanging on the fixed rope just to breathe. Passing was dangerous in the narrow gully, but climbers stacked below them anyway, burning time and oxygen as dawn approached. Where the couloir briefly widened near anchor points, Cheering forced short, risky passes, pressing Marcus into the wall while others clipped around them. Each pass cleared the line, but cost more minutes beneath the serac, time they wouldn't get back on the descent. At the top of the bottleneck, Marcus sat down in the snow and did not move for nearly 20 minutes. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, and his hands fumbled with simple tasks, reseating the mask, checking the carabiner gate, trying and failing to secure a strap. Cheering checked his oxygen saturation again. The display read 58%. Even at this altitude, that number aligned with what Cheering could see. Cognitive slowing, poor coordination, and the unmistakable beginning of high-altitude cerebral edema. Questions stopped landing normally. Instructions required repetition. Marcus's eyes drifted past Cheering rather than focusing on him. Cheering crouched beside him and emphasized the one thing that mattered, that they needed to descend immediately, that Marcus's condition would worsen with every meter they climbed higher, and that cerebral edema could progress from manageable symptoms to unconsciousness and death within hours. Marcus responded by pointing upward and returning to the summit bonus, making the situation painfully clear without needing additional explanation. Turning around meant Cheering would receive only the base payment, not the additional $10,000 his daughter's surgery required. The pressure wasn't subtle, it was the entire structure of the arrangement. Marcus had not tried to buy extra effort. He had tried to buy agreement, and agreement was exactly what the money was now demanding. Cheering made the decision that he would spend the rest of his life questioning. He helped Marcus stand, and they continued climbing toward the summit snowfield. The route traversed left out of the bottleneck across steep ground where a fall would send a climber tumbling thousands of feet down the south face. Gray dawn revealed the full scale of the surrounding Karakoram peaks and the vast emptiness below, a landscape that looked indifferent even in perfect light. Around 5:30 a.m., with the summit approximately 400 vertical feet above them, the wind began increasing. What had been calm conditions shifted into steady 20-mile-per-hour gusts, then sharper bursts that pushed spindrift across the slope like smoke. Cheering checked the time and calculated that they had exceeded conservative margins but remained within reach if Marcus could maintain pace. The forecast had promised stability, but forecasts on K2 were always probabilities. The wind felt like the mountain correcting the assumption that it would cooperate. At 28,100 feet, Marcus stopped responding coherently. He sat down in the snow and stared at the slope above without speaking. When Cheering tried to direct him, Marcus's face showed no recognition of what was being asked. When Cheering attempted to help him stand, Marcus's legs would not support his weight. The cerebral edema had progressed past the point where Marcus could participate in his own rescue. He remained conscious but non-functional, his brain too oxygen-starved to coordinate movement or process instructions. Cheering faced a situation with no good options. They were at 28,100 feet in worsening wind, with Marcus incapacitated and the summit close enough to feel like a taunt. Descending meant dragging dead weight down technical terrain in the death zone, a task barely possible under ideal conditions, and approaching impossible as the weather deteriorated. Continuing upward offered no realistic rescue value. Marcus was not going to recover by climbing higher, and the summit would not reverse swelling in his brain. Staying put meant waiting for Marcus to die, while Chering's own oxygen and judgment drained away. Cheering chose descent. He clipped Marcus's harness into the fixed line between them and began the work of lowering him back toward the traverse above the bottleneck. Supporting Marcus's weight required strength. Altitude had stripped from Cheering's muscles, coordination hypoxia had degraded, and visibility. The wind was steadily eroding. The temperature dropped as the gusts strengthened, falling toward minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill, cold enough that exposed skin would freeze within minutes. By 6 a.m., the wind had turned violent, building into a spindrift whiteout that erased the slope in moving snow. Headlamps became useless in the blowing crystals. The rope line began to rim over with ice and disappear beneath fresh drift. At anchor points, Cheering had to feel for the fixed rope through hardened crust, then manage transitions with numb hands while keeping Marcus from sliding away. Marcus's body sagged and twisted in the harness, adding unpredictable forces to every move. The risk of a mistake wasn't theoretical anymore. It was building with every minute. During one transition, with gusts striking broadside, Cheering could not see the next segment of fixed line. The rope had been buried under drifted snow and hardened spindrift, and the only reference was the vague outline of the slope and the pull of wind. Cheering shifted right, searching by feel for the line while keeping Marcus clipped to his own tether. The ground beneath their feet was not hard blue ice. It was wind-loaded snow sitting over older crust, snow that looked stable until weight found the weak layer underneath. The fracture was sudden and clean. A shallow wind slab cracked beneath them, the surface breaking in a single sheet that slid just enough to take their feet out from under them. It did not bury them. It simply moved them sideways and downhill onto harder, slicker ice beneath the drift, where an axe bite found nothing but glazed crust. The slab slid, and both men began accelerating as the angle steepened. Chiring drove his ice axe in again and again, trying to arrest, but his leverage was compromised by Marcus's weight attached to his harness and the fact that they were no longer on snow that could hold. The rope they had been searching for was now irrelevant. They were no longer on the route. They were on the mountain's face, sliding into open space. They tumbled approximately 800 vertical feet before impacting a rock band that stopped the fall violently. Cheering felt the jolt travel through his body before pain arrived, his left leg failing beneath him, his shoulder wrenched violently out of place, his head snapping hard enough that the sky vanished into static. His gloves were gone, stripped away somewhere in the tumble, and the cold bit into bare fingers the moment motion stopped. When awareness returned in fragments, he was wedged against rock at roughly 27,300 feet, unable to stand, unable to crawl. Snow hissed across the slope in wind strong enough to erase depth and distance. Below him, about 50 feet down slope, Marcus lay motionless in the snow, twisted at an angle that made it impossible to tell whether he was unconscious or worse. Cheering tried to call out, but the wind tore the sound away before it traveled anywhere. Pain sharpened as minutes passed. His left leg was shattered badly enough that even shifting sent lightning through his body. His shoulder hung loose. The cold crept steadily upward from his hands, sensation fading as the frostbite began its quiet work. The head injury left his thoughts sluggish, time stretching and collapsing without warning. His emergency beacon was still clipped to his harness, half buried in spindrift. Reaching it nearly knocked him unconscious. Activating it meant fumbling small switches with fingers already failing. After several attempts, he triggered the signal around 6:45 a.m. and slumped back as shock and hypothermia set in. The signal reached Camp 4 quickly, but the wind made movement impossible for hours. When conditions eased, 4 Pakistani high-altitude rescuers pushed out, following the beacon by memory as much as sight. They reached Cheering shortly after midday, hypothermic and barely conscious. Only then did one rescuer descend to check on Marcus. However, there was nothing to be done. Marcus Brennan was pronounced dead. The evacuation took 11 hours of careful, methodical lowering. Marcus's body was documented and left where it lay. At that altitude, recovery was impossible. Cheering was brought down to base camp, airlifted to Skardu when weather allowed, and transferred to Islamabad for emergency surgery. Doctors amputated several fingers, repaired his shattered leg as best they could, and treated a head injury that lingered long after the season ended. The physical damage was permanent, but the psychological damage ran deeper, with a persistent guilt that followed him long after he left the mountains behind. Cheering Dorje never returned to the death zone. On K2, the mountain doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care how much someone pays or what they believe they're owed. It only enforces one rule: every decision is final. It was May 23rd, 2018, on the upper flanks of a peak in the Khumbu region of Nepal, where the summit ridge sits above 27,000 feet, and the atmosphere holds roughly 1/3 the oxygen available at sea level. A place where the human body does not survive so much as it slowly stops functioning. Denise Caro was 41 years old and worked as a structural engineer for a mid-size infrastructure firm based in Portland, Oregon. She had spent 11 years assembling what looked like a strong mountaineering resume on paper, but much of it consisted of guided climbs where she leaned heavily on others while presenting herself as the most knowledgeable person in the group. She frequently argued with guides, questioned route decisions, and dismissed safety briefings as overly cautious. However, I do think that she was not reckless in her own mind. She simply believed she knew better than everyone else. Her colleagues described her as someone who triple-checked load calculations and kept a laminated checklist taped to her desk. And she carried that same attitude onto the mountain, correcting others and inserting herself into decisions she wasn't qualified to make. She had trained for this specific climb for 3 years. Altitude acclimatization rotations, supplemental oxygen drills, and 2 preparatory Himalayan expeditions in prior seasons, both of which included documented disagreements with guides over pacing and oxygen use. Her stated turnaround time was 2 p.m., the hard cutoff enforced by most experienced guides operating at extreme altitude. What investigators would later piece together is that she summited at approximately 1:45 p.m., 15 minutes ahead of the cutoff. That detail matters. It likely gave her a sense of margin she did not actually have. Descending climbers who passed her reported she was moving efficiently on the way up, but had lingered near the top longer than expected, resting, adjusting gear. By the time she turned around, it was past 2:30 p.m. Her supplemental oxygen canister, based on the flow rate logged by her guide team at base camp, had less than 90 minutes of supply remaining. Above 26,000 feet, what climbers refer to as the death zone, the human body cannot acclimatize. Cells begin dying faster than they regenerate. Cognitive function degrades within hours. Coordination, judgment, and fine motor. Control collapse in sequence, often before the person experiencing the decline is aware of it. Wind on the upper ridge that afternoon was measured at roughly 35 miles per hour with gusts near 50. Air temperature had dropped to approximately minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill pushing it closer to minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. At that altitude, muscles fail under exertion that would be trivial at sea level, and the brain begins making calculations it is no longer capable of completing correctly. At approximately 3:10 p.m., a descending rope team spotted Denise near the upper ridge. A climber named Haruki, part of a separate expedition, later gave a detailed account to investigators. He described her pace as reduced to small, dragging steps, crampons scraping rather than planting, her upper body pitching forward with each movement. She was not stopping to rest. She was simply unable to move faster. Haruki said her oxygen mask was still on, but the canister gauge visible from several meters away appeared to read empty. By 4 p.m., she had descended less than 300 feet from where the rope team first spotted her. Then, she went down. Haruki described her collapsing sideways against the slope, not falling, but folding. One knee first, then her hip, then her shoulder. She tried to push herself upright repeatedly, arms shaking violently with the effort. And each time she reached a partial upright position, she came back down. Her breathing had become audible from several meters away, a high-pitched wheeze carried on the wind, a sound Haruki said he had not heard from a person before. Her oxygen ran out completely sometime around 4:15 p.m. Without supplemental flow, deterioration accelerated. Frost began forming along the edges of her goggles and across her eyelashes, as well as on her eyebrows and the hair visible beneath her helmet. Her skin, exposed at the jaw and chin, had taken on a grayish, waxy tone that Haruki noted explicitly in his account. I've read a lot of accounts like this, and the image of frost forming over someone's eyes while they're still technically alive is something that doesn't leave you. Her eyes remained partially open. Haruki attempted to connect his own oxygen line to her mask, but her responsiveness had already faded to the point where she could not grip or assist the connection. She settled into a semi-curled position on the slope, one hand still gripping the webbing of her harness. Her breathing slowed to shallow, irregular intervals. Then it stopped. Haruki radioed base camp at approximately 4:40 p.m. A rescue team from the expedition's high camp attempted to reach her position, but was turned back by deteriorating wind conditions. They reached her body the following morning. The coroner's report, translated and summarized for the family, listed the cause of death as hypoxic respiratory failure compounded by hypothermia, with contributing factors including physical exhaustion and altitude-induced cognitive impairment. No equipment malfunction was identified. Everything functioned as designed. She simply ran out of time and oxygen in that order. Denise Carreau's body was recovered 2 days later and transported to base camp. Her family declined a public memorial. Haruki gave his full account to investigators and has not spoken publicly since. Climbers who crossed her path remembered the same pattern: confidence that bordered on entitlement, a refusal to follow guidance, and a tendency to treat safety limits as optional. The 45 minutes she spent at the summit were not an accident. They were a decision shaped by that mindset. At that altitude, that difference is fatal. It was May 9th, 2015, at Camp 2 on Mount Everest, 21,300 feet up. Thin air, minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures, hidden crevasses, and icy patches made every step risky. One misstep could be deadly. Tessa Crane, 37, worked as a corporate consultant in Chicago. She thrived on pushing herself in high-pressure situations and expected that same drive to carry her up Everest. She had climbed several 14,000-foot peaks in Colorado, but nothing had prepared her for the sustained physiological stress of staying above 18,000 feet. 18 months of training had convinced her she could handle the climb. I can see she trusted her mental toughness more than her body's signals. That's a mistake a lot of people make up here, thinking willpower is enough. Altitude sickness often begins subtly, a headache, mild nausea, dizziness. But at 21,000 feet, these early signs can escalate rapidly. On the morning of May 9th, Tessa reported a mild headache and slight nausea, but insisted she could continue to Camp 3. Her guide recommended immediate descent to Camp 1. She refused. I get it. She probably felt like stopping would mean failure. But up here, ignoring your body is never worth it. Over the next several hours, her condition worsened. The headache intensified, nausea turned into repeated vomiting, and dizziness made each step uncertain. The cold and wind made rest stops. Exhausting, slowing the team even more. Every fixed rope she gripped required extra effort, and her balance became progressively unreliable. I can't help thinking how small decisions start stacking up. The choice to push forward despite the warning signs is one that snowballs quickly. By early afternoon, Tessa had developed high-altitude cerebral edema, a condition where fluid buildup in the brain causes swelling that impairs thinking, coordination, and consciousness. Her steps were unsteady, her grip on ropes weakened, and she needed constant support from the guides. On a steep section between Camp 2 and 3, she collapsed entirely, unable to move on her own. Breathing became irregular, supplemental oxygen barely helped, and the technical terrain made any descent slow and risky. It's kinda terrifying seeing someone so prepared and determined get beaten by altitude. You train and prep for months, but the mountain has its own rules. The guides worked carefully to move her down, securing ropes and taking each step slowly. Her intermittent consciousness made coordination impossible, and at times, she was completely unresponsive. Weather conditions and steep slopes prevented a rapid evacuation. I can't imagine how helpless it must feel to watch, knowing every second counts, but there's only so much you can do at that height. Hours passed as her condition deteriorated. The guides monitored her vitals and tried to prevent further decline, but the combination of brain swelling, hypoxia, and physical exhaustion progressed beyond the point where rescue alone could reverse it. Eventually, she lost consciousness permanently. It's sobering. There's no arguing with physiology at this altitude. The body just shuts down when it can't cope. The medical officer later confirmed the cause of death as high-altitude cerebral edema, with contributing factors including her refusal to descend when symptoms first appeared and the delayed recognition of the severity of her condition. It's hard not to reflect on how quickly a summit goal can turn deadly when pride or determination overrides basic survival instincts. Her death was documented in the expedition's medical logs and reported to Nepalese authorities, as is required for all climbing fatalities. It's a harsh reminder that the mountain isn't forgiving. No amount of preparation, money, or drive changes the fact that ignoring the body's signals can be fatal. Even after the incident, the evidence left on the route, abandoned gear, disturbed snow, and the path where she struggled, served as a stark visual cue for future climbers about how quickly things can go wrong. Looking at it, I can't help but feel the weight of those final hours. The effort, the willpower, all of it, and yet the body had the final say. That's something that really sticks with you about high-altitude climbing. It was May 19th, 2014, at Camp 4 on a high-altitude expedition's peak in the Nepalese Himalayas. A cluster of tents pressed into compacted snow at roughly 26,000 feet, where the wind doesn't just blow, it dismantles. 3 climbers rested intermittently on supplemental oxygen through what became one of the quietest disasters the expedition would ever document. Nobody heard her go. Nobody heard anything after. Riva. Solmund was 38 years old and worked as a structural engineer at a mid-sized consulting firm in Oslo, Norway. She had been climbing for 14 years. alpine routes through Scandinavia and the Alps before moving to the 8,000ers. This was her third attempt at this summit. The first two had been turned back by weather, and she spent both trips loudly complaining about guides and stupid restrictions. Her teammates described her as controlling, someone who cross-referenced forecasts across 3 separate services, lectured constantly about their supposed errors, insisted on checking anchor placements herself, despite lacking real skill, and carried a laminated checklist she wielded like a badge of authority. She had taken 6 months of unpaid leave to prepare, though people said that much of that time was spent fussing over gear brands and arguing with trainers about why she deserved a personalized acclimatization plan. She was not strong and not quick, but she demanded the team follow her pace and listen to her advice. Her summit bid was planned for midnight on May 20th. At approximately 10:30 p.m. on the 19th, she left the tent, scowling and muttering about tent mates who slowed her down, insisting she needed air and couldn't wait for anyone else. The South Col is a flat, exposed saddle of glacial rock and ice with no natural windbreak in any direction. At 26,000 feet, jet stream winds can exceed 100 miles per hour without significant warning, and temperatures at night fall below minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Cognitive function at that altitude degrades measurably. Spatial reasoning deteriorates, reaction time slows. And critically, none of it feels the way it sounds from sea level. The body keeps moving, the mind just doesn't keep up. Lucen watched her headlamp move away from the tent line. Wind at that point was roughly 25 miles per hour, manageable for the elevation. Over the next hour, conditions shifted hard. Wind climbed past 60 miles per hour, temperature dropped further, visibility collapsed near zero. He called from the tent entrance twice. No response came back. At approximately 11:10 p.m., a climber in a nearby tent briefly spotted a faint light moving low to the ground, not tracking toward the fixed ropes or the camp perimeter, but erratic, close to the snow surface. It lasted a few seconds, then it was gone. That detail, one witness, a few seconds, is essentially all that exists of what happened to her in real time. The snow the next morning filled in the rest. Reva had walked less than 90 feet from the tent before her footprints began to lose direction. Spacing widened, the line drifted. Hypoxia at that altitude produces disorientation functionally indistinguishable from severe intoxication, and it compounds rapidly with cold. Her oxygen mask was found partially dislodged. A single glove was recovered approximately 10 feet away. I've read enough high-altitude incident summaries to know that 90 feet sounds like nothing, and that is precisely the problem. Beyond the glove, the stride marks transitioned into shallow drag impressions consistent with crawling. Based on depth and spacing, investigators estimated that movement covered roughly 15 feet before stopping entirely. Her body was found at approximately 6:40 a.m. by Lucen and 2 other expedition members, less than 100 feet from camp. She was face down, knees tucked beneath her torso, upper body folded forward. Ice had accumulated across her face and neck in dense, layered deposits consistent with several hours of exposure to sustained high-velocity wind. No distress signal had been activated. A mountain rescue liaison was notified by radio at 6:55 a.m. Her body was secured and relocated a short distance from the active camp area later that day due to conditions at that altitude. The expedition medical report later attributed the cause of death as fatal hypothermia with contributing hypoxic impairment. Everyone who knew Reva used roughly the same words: arrogant, controlling, overconfident. She lectured constantly, insisted on being right, and flaunted knowledge she didn't truly have. And still, less than 100 yards from shelter, in a storm that moved faster than any model had predicted, none of it mattered. That's the part most people don't absorb. The mountain doesn't negotiate with entitlement or attitude. It was April 22, 2014, in the lower Khumbu icefall on Mount Everest, around 19,500 feet. This section is one of the most dangerous on the route, with shifting ice towers, hidden crevasses, and thin snow bridges. Temperatures range from -5 degrees Fahrenheit to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, but wind and exposure made it feel much colder. Every step required careful footing, balance, and reliable gear. Lenora Svek, 39, worked as a fashion buyer in New York City and approached the climb like she did her career, focused on style and appearance. Her experience was limited to guided climbs of Mount Washington and Mount Whitney, where mistakes were minor inconveniences. On Everest, she prioritized how gear looked and felt over its functionality. I could already see this was going to be a problem. The mountain doesn't care about style, only what works. The icefall demanded specialized equipment, insulated gloves, heavy base layers, and full-body protection against sudden cold and exposure. Lenora had opted for lighter alternatives, arguing that bulk would slow her down. Her gloves were designed for moderate cold, not the sustained freezing conditions of the icefall. That morning, guides ran their routine equipment check and again recommended she switch to heavier gear. She refused. I get wanting to move faster or feel more comfortable, but in this environment, comfort isn't really the goal, survival is. Within the first hour, the consequences of her choices became apparent. She stopped frequently to adjust her layers and warm her hands, which were already showing signs of reduced circulation. Each pause slowed the team and increased exposure to unstable ice. Small issues start to stack up fast in places like this. That's how serious accidents begin. One minor misstep, then another, until it's too late. Lenora approached a ladder spanning a 40-foot crevasse. Her gloves had lost warmth, leaving fingers numb. Halfway across, she slipped, her right foot between rungs and left hand off the rail. Her harness caught her, but she fell partially into the crevasse. Still, her body slammed against the ice wall with enough force to fracture several ribs and inflict internal injuries. One small slip doesn't stay small in the icefall. The mountain turns minor mistakes into major consequences almost instantly. She was left suspended, unable to pull herself out. Her numb fingers made it impossible to assist in her own rescue. The team began a rope extraction, but the surrounding ice was unstable, and setting up safely took time. Every minute mattered as her injuries and exposure worsened. Hypothermia set in quickly without proper insulation. It's easy to underestimate how fast the cold drains you when movement is limited, and adrenaline can't protect you anymore. The team eventually managed to extract her, but her condition was critical. She was unresponsive, and attempts to stabilize her were limited by the terrain. The expedition's medical officer later confirmed the cause of death as internal injuries compounded by severe hypothermia, with contributing factors including inadequate protective gear and reduced dexterity from cold exposure. The warnings were clear early on, and the contributing factors were present before the incident. The incident was included in the season's climbing reports, emphasizing the vital role of proper equipment. One small detail, like gloves, ended up being a huge factor. Up here, there is no margin for error, no second chances. The icefall remained as treacherous as ever after the accident. The mountain didn't change. The risks stayed exactly the same. And that's the thing about climbing Everest. It doesn't negotiate, it doesn't adjust. It's unforgiving, and it doesn't care about your priorities or how much money you spent. Lenora's death demonstrated how personal preference and underestimating environmental hazards can have fatal consequences, especially when combined with technical terrain and extreme cold. It's sobering to realize that a decision as small as lighter gloves or an easier outfit could set off a chain of events that no one can reverse once it starts. It was April 3rd, 2025, and Elena Ray Alonso Martin stood there with her phone raised, framing the mountain behind her as she introduced her followers to the sheer scale of what she was about to attempt. But before any of that, before the climb, before the footage, before things started to go wrong, you need to understand who she was, because that context matters more than anything that comes next. Her name isn't something I'm gonna keep repeating out of respect for her family, but she was 26, she was Spanish, and she had built a decent following on TikTok doing hiking content. Think nature shots, summit selfies, that kind of stuff. She had this tough girl energy that people genuinely loved. She wasn't the polished, filtered influencer type. She was more raw, more real, and that's exactly why people connected with her. But here's the thing. Before all of that, her life had kind of fallen apart. About 2 years before Everest, she went through a really rough patch. Her long-term relationship ended, and not in a clean way. She had cheated on her boyfriend, he found out, and he left. And then, almost like the universe was piling on, she lost her job around the same time. For close to 2 years after that, by all accounts from people who knew her, she was kind of just drifting. No clear direction, no real purpose. And I'm not saying any of that to judge her. Honestly, I think a lot of us have been in some version of that place, where you don't really know who you are or what you're supposed to be doing. It's a genuinely uncomfortable place to sit in. What pulled her out of it, eventually, was the mountains. And TikTok. She started hiking. She started. Seriously, filming it, posting it, and the response gave her something she hadn't felt in a long time. Identity, direction. People called her brave, inspiring. After 2 years of feeling lost, that kind of feedback is powerful, maybe even addictive. Here's where you need to pay attention, because this part gets overlooked. Her content followed a clear escalation pattern. She started with Picos de Europa, beautiful, manageable mountains in northern Spain. Then Montserrat, the jagged range in Catalonia. Then Sierra Nevada, higher elevation, more demanding. Each step felt natural, even impressive. Her followers grew, the praise got louder, but there was something hiding in plain sight. She had no real technical training. Her gear was functional, but not what serious mountaineers would call appropriate. She was leveling up the mountains without leveling up the skills, and her followers didn't see that. They saw the views, the confidence, the aesthetic. Nobody asked about her, a technique. They just told her she was incredible, that she should keep going. Exactly what she likely wanted to hear. That feedback loop is dangerous. I think about it a lot, even with my own channel. The audience rewards the result, not the process. And sometimes, the process gets skipped. This is the moment I keep coming back to, the turning point. In Sierra Nevada, she was filming. She left the marked trail to get a better angle. That's such a TikTok thing, right? The shot matters more than the path. So she climbed onto an unstable rock section for the perfect frame. She slipped, she slid. She stopped herself at the last second. The injury was minor, cuts and bruises, but it was real, a genuine scare. Her body had just told her clearly that she made a dangerous call, and what did she do? She posted it, laughed it off on camera. The video did well. People thought it was funny, thought it proved how tough she was. And that moment, right there, reframed a near disaster into a personality trait. She falls and laughs. She's fearless. But fearless and reckless aren't the same. In Sierra Nevada, she learned the wrong lesson. Not, I need training, but I can handle it. The TikTok metrics agreed. The mountain eventually would not. According to her friends, it happened late at night. She was scrolling TikTok when she saw a video about climbing Everest. We don't know what was in it. Maybe a summit shot, maybe someone else's triumph, but it clearly hit something deep. She reposted it. That sounds like nothing. People repost things all the time. But here's the detail that made this particular repost so haunting. After her death, when people started going back through her account trying to understand her, they found that out of everything she had ever shared or reposted on TikTok, that Everest video was the only repost on her entire account. Think about that for a second. She saw one video, she shared it, and then she started making plans. I'm not saying TikTok killed her, that's too simple. But I do think that one late night scroll session planted a seed in someone who was already hungry for the next peak, the next milestone, the next story to tell. Okay, so this is important because a lot of people assume that climbing Everest requires years of documented mountaineering experience and some intense vetting process. And while that's true for the most demanding, self-supported expeditions, there's another side to this industry that doesn't get talked about enough. She didn't go rogue. She didn't sneak onto the mountain. She booked a commercial Everest expedition. Her parents, who were described as financially comfortable, helped fund it. And we're talking real money here. These packages typically run somewhere between $40,000 and $70,000, depending on the company and what's included. And here's the uncomfortable truth about some of these commercial operations. If you can pay, you can go. Not all of them. There are reputable guiding companies with strict experience requirements, but there are also others that, let's be honest, are running a business. They provide Sherpas, oxygen tanks, fixed ropes along the established route, and base camp support. And for that price tag, some of them are willing to bring along clients who don't exactly have a resume full of high altitude climbs. So she got a permit, she got access, she had a Sherpa assigned to her. On paper, she was doing everything right. What she didn't have was the experience. The kind of experience that doesn't show up on a booking form. The kind that lives in your body, in your lungs, in your muscles, in the way your brain functions at 26,000 feet, when it's getting a fraction of the oxygen it normally needs. You can buy your way onto the mountain. You cannot buy your way into being ready for it. When she met her assigned Sherpa at base camp on Mount Everest, it became clear pretty quickly that there was a mismatch. Sherpas are not just mountain guides in the basic sense. These are people who have lived at altitude their whole lives, often in villages above 10,000 feet, who have summited Everest multiple times, and who understand the mountain in a way that goes beyond training. They read weather shifts in the wind, instability in the ice, and exhaustion in a climber's posture before it's ever spoken out loud. Everest Base Camp itself sits at roughly 17,600 feet, already higher than most mountains in Europe. Even standing there, doing nothing, your body is under stress. Oxygen levels are about half of what they are at sea level. People lose their appetite. Sleep becomes shallow. Headaches are common before the climb has even really started. And above base camp is the Khumbu Icefall, a constantly shifting maze of ice towers and deep crevasses that climbers have to cross using ladders and fixed ropes. It's one of the most dangerous sections of the entire route. Not because it's technically complex, but because it's alive. It moves. Her Sherpa noticed immediately. She was inexperienced. She was confident in a way that didn't match what he was seeing. Later, people who knew him reconstructed the general shape of their early conversations. And what came through was that he raised questions about her preparation and her background early on. Her response essentially was to reassure him. She had done mountains before. She was fit. She could handle it. I want to be really clear here. This isn't a story about a villain. Her Sherpa was doing his job, doing it well, and trying to look out for someone in his care. And she wasn't lying. She had done mountains before. She just didn't fully grasp the difference between the mountains she had done and the one she was standing at the base of. Everest isn't just taller. It exists in what climbers call the death zone, above 26,000 feet, where the human body literally cannot acclimatize. Every step higher is a slow deterioration. That gap in understanding is, I think, one of the saddest parts of this whole thing. The early sections of an Everest climb are physically brutal in a way that's hard to describe if you've never experienced high altitude, and she struggled. Early on, moving through the Khumbu Icefall and into Camp 1, she was having trouble breathing at a pace that would have been routine for more experienced climbers. Even simple movements, stepping over a ladder spanning a crevasse, clipping into a rope, require focus when your brain is already oxygen deprived. Her Sherpa slowed everything down to accommodate her, which is actually standard practice. But it was a clear early signal. Beyond that, the route opens into the western CWM, a wide glacier valley that looks deceptively calm. It's often described as a solar oven. The sunlight reflects off the surrounding ice walls and snow, trapping heat. Climbers can overheat during the day and then face freezing temperatures just hours later. It's physically disorienting. Hot, cold, dehydrated, exhausted, all at once. And that kind of stress compounds fast if your body isn't adapting. Then, higher up toward Camp 2 and beyond, it got worse. She developed a headache. Not a, I need some water and an aspirin headache. The kind that settles behind your eyes and doesn't leave. Nausea followed. Then a kind of full-body weakness that altitude sickness produces in people whose bodies aren't adapting well to the thin air. At those elevations, this isn't just discomfort. It's the early stages of something that can turn fatal. High-altitude cerebral or pulmonary edema, where the brain or lungs begin to swell. Her body was sending every distress signal it had. The mountain was communicating clearly, and I think part of her knew, because how could she not, that something was wrong. But here's where the TikTok piece comes back in, and this is the part that really gets to me. At some point during the climb, likely somewhere above Camp 2, as they prepared to push higher toward the Lhotse face, a steep wall of blue ice that requires fixed ropes and precise footing, she insisted on going live. This is a detail that sticks with me. She set up her phone, she went on TikTok live, and for about 2 minutes she talked to her followers. Behind her was one of the harshest environments on Earth. Temperatures well below freezing, winds that can pick up without warning, and air so thin that even speaking in full sentences costs energy. She looked energetic. She talked about how amazing it was, how beautiful the view was, how grateful she felt. The comments were almost certainly going wild, people cheering her on. Heart emojis and fire emojis and "you've got this" from thousands of people who had no idea what her body was actually going through, what that altitude does to your blood oxygen, your coordination, your judgment. And then the live stream ended, and she was immediately exhausted. That 2-minute performance had cost her something. Up there, energy isn't just fatigue, it's survival. Every unnecessary movement, every extra breath, every moment spent not conserving strength adds up. And from what people reconstructed afterward, it was shortly after this that her Sherpa made a direct recommendation to turn back. He had been watching her. He had seen what the live stream concealed. He knew what the climb still ahead of them demanded. The push through the death zone, the summit, and more importantly, the descent. She said no. She wanted to keep going. Her reasoning, as best as people could piece it together later, came down to 3 things: her followers, proving herself, and pride. She had come this far. She had told everyone she was doing this. Turning back on Everest isn't just a physical decision, it's psychological. It feels like failure, even though in reality, turning back is one of the most respected decisions a climber can make. But in that moment, standing on a mountain where the margin for error is almost zero, She chose to keep going, and I genuinely understand that feeling, even as I wish she had made a different call. When your identity is built on the content you create, turning back from a summit feels like erasing yourself. As they pushed higher, the weather started shifting. Conditions on Everest can change with almost no warning, and what had been a manageable climb was becoming something more serious. Her Sherpa, by multiple accounts, strongly advised stopping. He was direct about the risk. He specifically pointed to her physical condition, the altitude sickness symptoms, the exhaustion, the pace she had been keeping, and told her that continuing in that state was genuinely dangerous. She chose to continue, and here's the thing that makes this story so complicated. She actually reached the summit, against everything her body was telling her, against the weather, against the advice of someone who knew that mountain better than almost anyone on Earth. She made it to the top of Everest. She filmed it. She was emotional and triumphant, and she hugged her Sherpa, and she stood at the highest point on the planet. I want to sit with that for a second, because it's important. She wasn't delusional. She wasn't just someone who stumbled onto the mountain without any capability whatsoever. She made it to the summit of Everest. That's real. That happened. But summiting Everest is only half the story, and it's not the half that kills people. The majority of deaths on Everest don't happen on the way up. They happen on the way down. And this is something that a lot of people, including, it seems, a lot of people who book commercial expeditions without sufficient experience, don't fully internalize until they're in it. Here's why the descent is so deadly. By the time you reach the summit, you have burned through enormous amounts of energy, you're operating on low oxygen, your body is breaking down, and your brain, the thing you need to make good decisions and maintain physical coordination, is functioning at a reduced level, and then you have to navigate back down the same terrain that challenged you on the way up. Except now you're operating at a fraction of your capacity. For her, by the time the descent began, she was running on empty in every way that mattered, completely exhausted, mentally drained. Her oxygen levels were dangerously low. Her reactions were slow. The fatal moment happened on a narrow, exposed section of the descent route. She misstepped. Just slightly, caught her foot wrong, lost her footing on the hard, glassy ice. In that instant, there was a pause. The kind where your body is supposed to correct itself automatically, but it didn't, because her reaction time was gone, stripped down by exhaustion, by oxygen deprivation, by hours of cumulative strain. She couldn't stabilize the way a rested, experienced climber might have been able to. She slid, a short, uncontrolled shift at first. Then her center of gravity tipped past the point of recovery, and she fell. The terrain on that section of Everest doesn't give you anything back. There's no forgiving slope, no rough surface to grab onto. Nothing like the Sierra Nevada slip she once walked away from. It just drops. Steep, cold, absolute. Her Sherpa, who had been tracking every step she took on the descent and staying within reach, reacted immediately. But even immediate isn't fast enough when gravity takes over on that kind of terrain. She was gone before any real rescue attempt could be mounted. At that altitude, in those conditions, above 26,000 feet, where helicopters can't reliably operate, where even standing still for too long drains the body. There was no window, no second chance, no realistic intervention. The mountain doesn't pause. It doesn't allow for it. The expedition team recovered what they could and documented the incident the way these situations are formally handled on Everest, with a kind of clinical efficiency that feels brutal, but is really just the reality of what that mountain demands of everyone on it. Back online, her parents took her TikTok account offline, but before they did, the internet had already found what it was looking for. Her followers grew after her death. One of those deeply uncomfortable patterns of social media that says something uncomfortable about how we consume tragedy. And people going back through her content found two things: the Everest repost, sitting alone as the only thing she had ever shared from someone else's account, and the old risky content, the Sierra Nevada slip, the moments where she had laughed off things that shouldn't have been laughed off. Her Sherpa, in an interview afterward, said that she was determined, and that determination is not the same as experience. He also said that he had warned her about the descent specifically, because that is where people don't realize how dangerous Everest really is. Her mother said that her daughter had finally found something that gave her peace, and then she said that she just wished it wasn't that mountain. This isn't a story about TikTok being evil. It's a story about what happens when the feedback you get from the internet starts to feel more trustworthy than the feedback you get from your own body, your own preparation, and the people who actually know what they're talking about. Everest is not a trend. It's not a TikTok challenge. It's not the next level after Sierra Nevada. It requires years of progressively harder climbs, technical training, physical preparation, and a level of respect for the environment that goes way beyond any number of followers or any amount of money. It was May 14, 2016, on the balcony, a wind-scoured shelf at 27,500 feet on Everest's southeast ridge, when Talia Bren, fuming and impatient, complained loudly about the slow idiots ahead of her, tapped her crampons impatiently, and demanded everyone let her pass, a 2-minute rest turning fatal in the thin air. Talia was 38, a self-assured earth science teacher from Portland, Oregon, who believed she knew more than the guides and apparently resented anyone questioning her judgment. She had only a handful of technical climbs to her name: easy Cascades routes, a single Aconcagua summit, and 2 aborted Himalayan attempts where the guide said later that she blamed the weather rather than her lack of experience. She had never attempted a true high-altitude push without supplemental oxygen. I personally think that for her, Everest was less a goal than a trophy she felt entitled to conquer. Preparation for Talia was more about appearances than skill. She carried a pulse oximeter and logged readings obsessively, but only to prove to herself and others how capable she was. She had been vocal about summiting without supplemental oxygen, dismissing guides' warnings as unnecessary, and she openly criticized climbers who relied on bottles. On summit night, the emergency oxygen bottle was recovered from her pack, valve closed, unused, despite repeated offers from guides to help her use it. The death zone, above 26,000 feet, is a clinical designation, not a dramatic one. At that altitude, oxygen partial pressure falls to roughly 1/3 of sea level. The brain deteriorates before the body does, and in ways the person experiencing it cannot reliably detect. Judgment degrades first. A climber can report feeling sharp while visibly impaired to everyone nearby. The body compensates through faster breathing and elevated heart rate, which simultaneously drains fluid reserves and accelerates exhaustion. No acclimatization replaces what the air simply withholds. Talia reached the balcony just before 5 a.m., roughly 7 hours into her summit push with no supplemental oxygen. A Spanish climber named Dario Vela, moving just ahead of her, glanced back at her brash comments as she complained about useless Sherpas slowing progress, and ignored every caution about pacing. She swayed while seated, barely noticing the tilt. When asked how she felt, she waved him off, saying she was fine, with a tone that suggested annoyance rather than honesty. Her lips were noticeably darker than normal, but she dismissed it as a minor inconvenience. I'll be honest, that one detail told me exactly where this story was going before I even finished reading it. Within minutes, Talia stood abruptly and went still. She stared forward without fixing on anything. Her breathing became audible, uneven, labored, carrying a faint wet quality that experienced high-altitude climbers associate with fluid collecting in the lungs. She began producing fragmented phrases that neither Dario nor the Sherpa guide beside him could interpret. Her movements became uncoordinated, and she struggled to keep her balance. Then she stepped sideways and went down into the snow without bracing herself. Dario and the Sherpa, a man named Pemba, reached her immediately. Her body had gone fully slack. No resistance, no self-support. They managed to get her partially upright before her weight shifted back. Her eyes opened once, briefly, without tracking either of them. Her lips had deepened to a blue-purple visible even in low light. Pemba reached for her emergency oxygen bottle and worked the mask toward her face. Her breathing had already reduced to slow, widely, all spaced gasps. The mask was positioned but produced no meaningful response beneath it. Frost was forming along her nostrils and across her eyelashes. The gasps continued to space further apart. Pemba radioed base camp at approximately 5:08 a.m. Given their position on the route, any response team would have required several hours to reach them under those conditions. Talia became fully unresponsive within several minutes of collapsing. Sustained manual attempts to assist her breathing produced no recovery. The expedition report later listed the presumed cause of death as hypoxic brain injury, secondary to severe high-altitude cerebral and pulmonary edema, with secondary cardiac arrest. In plain terms, the brain and lungs filled with fluid, oxygen saturation dropped below the threshold for consciousness, and the heart stopped. No traumatic injuries, equipment undamaged. The oxygen bottle in her pack was full. Her school held a service the following month. The expedition leader released a terse statement noting her choices were deliberate. Fellow climbers remembered her arrogance and refusal to heed warnings. What makes this story chilling is that Talia knew the risks, carried the tools to survive, and still dismissed them at every stage. Her final acts were not ignorance. They were the result of overconfidence and entitlement. That gap between knowing and acting, fueled by arrogance, is what ultimately killed her. It was June 27, 2017, at Angel's Landing, where the final approach required hikers to navigate a narrow sandstone ridge, 5,790 feet above sea level, exposed on both sides with only partial chains for protection. Maribel Quent, 34, owned a boutique clothing store in San Diego and frequently shared curated travel photos online. Though she had moderate hiking experience, her focus was more on capturing the perfect shot than following safety rules. From what I see, her priority wasn't the summit, it was the photograph. The final half mile of the trail is a narrow ridge with drop-offs exceeding 1,000 feet. By midday, temperatures had climbed to around 95 degrees Fahrenheit. The sandstone surfaces were polished from years of foot traffic, with smooth areas made even more slippery by a thin layer of sand blown across the trail by the wind. Chains were available in some of the most exposed sections, but large portions of the ridge remained unprotected, relying entirely on hikers' judgment and careful movement. Even under normal conditions, this ridge can be unforgiving. Add a layer of loose sand and heat, and one misstep is all it takes. Signs posted along the trail warned hikers to stay on the designated path and avoid venturing onto unprotected ledges. Rangers that morning had briefed visitors on recent incidents involving photographers stepping off trail. Maribel had heard the warnings, but dismissed them as excessive. She moved beyond the chain several times to adjust for better shots, shifting her stance and testing the edges to get the right angle. From where I'm looking, it probably seemed harmless to her at the time. But on a narrow, exposed ridge like that, every extra step onto unstable ground made an accident far more likely. As she neared the summit, she spotted a ledge about 8 feet beyond the official trail that promised a clear, unobstructed view of the valley below. From a distance, it looked stable, but it was sloped and covered in loose sand. Maribel stepped past the boundary rope and moved toward the ledge, testing each foot placement carefully, but missing how the surface could shift beneath her. Her camera bag, weighing roughly 12 pounds, subtly shifted her center of gravity, forcing her to lean forward slightly to maintain balance. Here, you can see how even a small shift in weight or footing can completely change your stability. Those few extra pounds made the difference. Sandstone beneath her was smooth, with almost no texture to grip. As she adjusted for the photo, her right foot began to slide on the sand. She tried to correct, but instead accelerated the movement. Her hands reached for a hold, but the smooth rock offered nothing to grab. Within seconds, she was sliding uncontrollably toward the edge. Momentum carried her over the precipice. Witnesses reported she disappeared from view almost instantly. The fall was estimated at roughly 1,000 feet. That moment is almost impossible to stop once it begins. One slip and gravity takes over. It's a brutal reminder of how thin the line is between safe and fatal. Other hikers immediately alerted park rangers via emergency communications. Immediate rescue was impossible due to the exposed terrain, so recovery waited until conditions allowed a helicopter later that afternoon. Death was confirmed as instantaneous from blunt force trauma, with contributing factors including leaving the trail unstable, footing, and extra weight from her camera. It's striking how fast it happened. A few missteps off the trail, and that was enough. Everything else just made it worse. The incident received little public attention, noted only in seasonal park reports, serving as a reminder that even routine hikes can turn fatal when safety boundaries are ignored. Looking back, the decision to prioritize a photograph over safety stands out clearly. It's easy to think you can handle this, but the mountain doesn't negotiate. That's what makes incidents like this so sobering. The consequences arrive before you even realize the danger. It was May 21st, 2017, on the southeast ridge of the world's highest peak in the Himalayan range of Nepal, where a fixed rope queue had stalled for over 40 minutes at the Hillary Step. The combination of commercial crowding, extreme altitude, and one unclipped carabiner was already in the process of becoming fatal. Maribel Kaplan was 38 and worked as a regional sales director for a pharmaceutical distribution company in Houston, Texas. She had taken up mountaineering in her early 30s following a divorce, progressing through technical peaks in South America and Central Asia over 5 years. The summit had been a publicly announced goal, posted on her company's internal blog 2 years prior. She paid a commercial guiding company roughly $60,000 for the permit, logistics, and summit attempt. She arrived at base camp 8 weeks earlier and completed 2 acclimatization rotations. Already frustrated with the slow pace and convinced she deserved priority, she muttered complaints under her breath, voice sharp enough that fellow climbers 2 positions away glanced over with annoyance. The former Hillary Step area, in busy season, functions less like a climbing challenge and more like a single-file bottleneck, with lethal consequences for any uncontrolled movement. The fixed ropes anchored along its face are the only barrier between a climber and a drop of several thousand feet off the exposed ridge. At roughly 28,700 feet, the human body operates on a fraction of sea level oxygen, and the impairment to both judgment and fine motor, coordination is measurable and well documented. On this particular morning, 11 climbers were compressed onto terrain that comfortably accommodates 3. Temperature sat near negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with sustained winds of 30 miles per hour. By 6:10 a.m., Maribel had been stationary on the ledge for nearly 45 minutes. By now, her impatience had escalated into open irritation. She jabbed her ice axe against the ledge, huffing audibly and glaring at climbers ahead of her, occasionally snapping at the guide to move faster. Stefan Brauer, a 44-year-old German climber with 2 prior Himalayan summits, was positioned roughly 6 feet above her on the fixed rope. Below her, a Nepali high-altitude guide named Nima Sherpa was managing the group's spacing. The ledge at that section was barely 2 feet wide, ice-coated rock with a clean vertical drop on the downhill side. At approximately 6:15 a.m., the queue stalled again. Maribel unclipped from the fixed rope. Stefan, looking down at that moment, called out for her to stop. She moved sideways regardless, attempting to pass 2 climbers directly above her. Personally, I think exhaustion stops being a background detail at this exact moment and becomes the actual cause of everything that follows. Her crampons scraped audibly against the mixed ice and granite surface as she shifted her weight laterally. One crampon failed to bite. Her left foot swung outward and found no purchase. The slip was immediate. Her arms came out to both sides, no rope within reach, no surface to catch against. She fell backward between 30 and 40 feet and struck an exposed rock outcrop head first before coming to rest on a sloped ice shelf below. The impact was visible to at least 3 climbers above. Her helmet split along the right side on contact. Blood spread across the ice beneath her head within seconds. Her body moved once, a single involuntary contraction, then went completely still. Stefan called out. A second climber above him immediately began calling down to Nima. Nima reached her within minutes. He found no breathing and severe cranial trauma visible beneath the fractured edge of her helmet. Given the extent of visible injuries and the altitude, no resuscitation attempt was considered viable. I find it hard not to think about what happens if she simply stays clipped to that rope for another 10 minutes. That thought doesn't go anywhere, but it doesn't leave either. She was confirmed dead before any medical team reached her. The report concluded death occurred at the scene. Maribel's company posted a tribute on their internal platform 2 days after news reached Houston. The summit photograph she had promised to share with her team was never taken. What I keep returning to is that the guiding company's post-season incident documentation categorized this under client decision. And the framing, more than anything else in this story, is the most honest thing they probably ever said about how commercial high-altitude operations actually work. It was May 11th, 2013, on the ascent to Camp 3 at 23,500 feet, a steep, narrow ice route with fixed ropes. Temperatures hovered around minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and wind and exposure made any pause risky. Every step demanded full focus. Hesitation or distraction could be deadly. Noreen Valek, 36, managed human resources for a tech company in Seattle. She was assertive, confident, and used to challenging authority in her professional life. That same mindset carried over to Everest, where she consistently questioned her guide's decisions and safety protocols. Her previous trekking experience included portions of the Annapurna Circuit and Mount Rainier, but she had never faced terrain where hesitation and debate could be fatal. I could already sense that her instinct to argue and analyze every decision wasn't going to mix well with the death zone. The route from Camp 2 to Camp 3 required precise timing and coordination. Climbers depended on the fixed rope system to keep traffic moving steadily, with designated rest points where they could pause safely. Delays in the middle of technical sections created bottlenecks, forcing other climbers into exposed positions and increasing the overall risk for the team. Noreen's habit of stopping mid-route to question instructions had already caused minor slowdowns during the expedition, but on this day, it would prove disastrous. As the team approached a particularly narrow section of steep ice, Noreen began challenging the guide's pacing instructions and route choice. Instead of moving steadily through the dangerous section, she stopped to argue, insisting her concerns be addressed immediately. Other climbers were forced to wait in exposed positions while she debated the plan. From what I can see, this was exactly the kind of split-second distraction that the mountain doesn't forgive. Her guide repeatedly told her to continue and save discussions for the designated rest point, but she refused. The delay created a bottleneck, backing up several climbers on the fixed rope. While focused on the argument, Noreen failed to pay full attention to her footing and body position. As she gestured during the discussion, her crampon caught on the rope, and she lost her balance. The fall was arrested by her climbing harness, but she swung into the ice face with considerable force. The impact caused head trauma and internal injuries. It's hard not to notice how quickly a single lapse of attention can turn a routine crossing into a fatal moment. Other climbers, still stuck in the bottleneck, were unable to provide immediate assistance. The harsh conditions, freezing temperatures, wind, and exposure made rapid help impossible. Noreen's injuries, combined with prolonged exposure, quickly overwhelmed her body's ability to maintain core functions. The guides attempted emergency stabilization, but the technical terrain prevented effective treatment or swift evacuation to a safer location. As hours passed, her condition worsened. Hypothermia set in alongside her injuries, and consciousness slipped away. Despite every effort, she could not be revived. The expedition medical officer later determined that her death resulted from blunt force trauma, complicated by severe hypothermia, with key contributing factors including the delayed response during a critical moment and failure to maintain focus while navigating technical terrain. Watching her choices pile up like this, it's clear how small decisions, stopping, debating, hesitating, stack into irreversible consequences in this environment. The incident was recorded in climbing logs as a stark example of how communication issues, hesitation, and delayed compliance can become fatal in extreme conditions. Noreen's tendency to challenge authority and assert her personal approach to climbing had ultimately cost her life. It's a tough reminder that on mountains like Everest, there's no room for ego or debate. The protocol exists for survival, and ignoring it is a gamble with zero margin for error. Her death illustrated the same harsh reality that had claimed others before her. In high-risk environments, prioritizing personal preferences over established safety measures can be deadly. Even experienced professionals used to managing and challenging situations in their work are not immune when the mountain demands immediate compliance. I can't help but feel that every step she took reflected her mindset. But on Everest, the mountain is always the final authority. It was April 22nd, 2017, and the afternoon sun at Everest Base Camp had softened the glacial moraine into a patchwork of gray slush and exposed rock. The temperature sat around 30 degrees Fahrenheit, mild by Khumbu standards, with a steady wind that carried the smell of cooking fuel and damp nylon across the sprawling tent city. Prayer flags hung in dense lines between cairns, their colors bleached by seasons of ultraviolet light. The camp spread across the uneven glacier in clusters organized by expedition company, each group separated by trails of boot-packed ice and the invisible boundaries of liability. Among the arrivals that week was a shipment of equipment that drew attention from neighboring expeditions. Multiple duffel bags bearing custom tags were carried by a porter team, nearly twice the size most operators used. So, from the information I found, the gear included a heated sleeping system, a portable shower unit, a satellite communication hub, and enough personal supplies to stock a small camp independently. The equipment belonged to Victoria Ashworth, a 51-year-old British woman who had paid more for her Everest expedition than most people earned in a decade, a whopping $500,000. And I want you to keep that number in your head as this story unfolds. Victoria had built a luxury wellness brand from scratch in her 30s, grown it into a company valued in the tens of millions, and sold it at 48 for an amount that allowed her to redefine what the rest of her life would look like. What followed the sale was a rapid and public transformation, from corporate executive to adventure philanthropist, documented across social media with the production quality of someone who understood branding. She funded expeditions, spoke at charity galas tied to outdoor causes, and positioned herself as a woman, proving that ambition had no expiration date. The content was polished, aspirational, and relentlessly on message. However, I learned that her climbing resume was thinner than the narrative suggested. She had summited Kilimanjaro on a guided luxury safari-style expedition. She had climbed Mont Blanc with a guide and returned by helicopter. 2 years earlier, she had completed a trek to Everest Base Camp, walking, not climbing, and posted about it as a transformative experience that planted the seed for a full summit attempt. She had never been above 20,000 feet under her own power. She had never used crampons on steep ice. She had never spent a night above Camp 2 on any mountain. What she had was money, conviction, and a public narrative that could not accommodate failure. From everything I found on her background, nothing in her climbing history prepared her for what Everest demands above 23,000 feet. The $500,000 she paid to a premium Kathmandu-based operator bought a bespoke expedition package designed for ultra-high net worth clients who wanted the summit experience with every possible support structure in place. The fee included a dedicated 3 Sherpa team assigned exclusively to her, an expedition doctor on standby at base camp connected via satellite, unlimited supplemental oxygen beyond the standard allocation, a custom nutrition plan, and satellite equipment for posting updates throughout the climb. So, I think it's fair to say the package was, in essence, an attempt to engineer certainty on a mountain that offered none. So, I don't know whether to find this funny or frustrating, but Victoria had framed the expedition publicly as a fundraiser for a women's education charity, a cause she supported genuinely, having raised over $200,000 in pledges tied to her reaching the summit. But the charity framing carried a weight that extended beyond generosity. She had announced a summit date on her social channels. Sponsors were watching. Media outlets had been briefed. The narrative was locked in before she set foot on the glacier, and every dollar pledged added pressure to a decision that should have remained flexible. Also, I found out that her lead Sherpa had a pretty impressive resume to his name. Chewang Dorje Lama, early 40s, 10 Everest summits, raised in a village near Namche Bazaar. Chewang was known in the guiding community for 2 things: his patience with difficult clients and his ability to read conditions on the upper mountain with a precision that other guides trusted more than weather forecasts. He had turned clients around on 3 previous expeditions, twice for weather, once for a client showing early signs of cerebral edema at Camp 3. In each case, the client had later thanked him. He was not accustomed to being overruled, but believe me, that changes here. His support team consisted of Ngawang Chuldim, late 20s, 3 Everest summits, known for his speed and strength on the fixed ropes, and Pemba Thendu, early 30s, 4 summits, experience with oxygen management and high-altitude medical emergencies. Together, the 3 Sherpas represented more than 30 combined years of Himalayan experience, a team assembled specifically because the expedition leader recognized that Victoria would need more support than a standard client. Other clients in the expedition later noted that Victoria's Sherpa team was larger than any they had seen, assigned to a single climber. The allocation raised eyebrows. It meant fewer support resources available for the rest of the group, a trade-off that benefited one client at the expense of everyone else. And from what I gathered, that resentment was already building before the first rotation even began. The acclimatization rotations began in late April, and the problems started immediately. The first rotation, through the Khumbu Icefall to Camp 1 at 19,900 feet, took Victoria nearly twice as long as other clients in the expedition. The icefall was a constantly shifting maze of ice towers, ladder crossings over open crevasses, and unstable seracs that groaned and cracked in the warming sun. Climbers moved through it in pre-dawn darkness to minimize exposure during solar heating. Victoria required constant assistance on the ladder crossings. Her crampon placements were uncertain, her balance unsteady, her breathing labored at an altitude where acclimatized climbers moved with relative ease. Chewang stayed within arm's reach the entire way, guiding her feet onto ladder rungs, steadying her on narrow ice bridges, absorbing delays that stretched the team's exposure in the most dangerous section of the route. And I think the part that frustrates me most is that Chewang could already see where this was heading, and nobody with authority would listen. At Camp 2 in the western CDM, Victoria's appetite disappeared. The altitude suppressed her hunger entirely, and despite the custom nutrition plan, she could not force down enough calories to sustain her body's demands. She lost weight visibly over the first 2 weeks. Other climbers at Camp 2 observed that Victoria spent most rest days inside her tent, communicating via satellite with her media team and sponsors rather than resting or eating. The calories her body needed were being replaced by conversations about content schedules and summit timelines. Honestly, priorities like that at 21,000 feet are just hard to understand and make me mad every time I come across them. Her sleep was disrupted by periodic breathing, a common altitude response where the body alternates between rapid breaths and alarming pauses, leaving her exhausted each morning, despite hours in her sleeping bag. Chewang noted the deterioration and communicated his concerns to the expedition leader at base camp through a private radio channel the client could not hear. If you've watched my other videos on Everest expedition dynamics, you know this is exactly when operators should be pulling the plug. The third rotation, to Camp 3 at 23,500 feet on the Lhotse face, confirmed what Chewang already suspected. The Lhotse face was a continuous wall of blue ice rising over 3,700 vertical feet, at angles between 40 and 50 degrees. Climbers ascended on fixed ropes using mechanical ascenders, each step requiring precise crampon placement on surfaces that offered no forgiveness for mistakes. Victoria could not maintain a consistent pace. Her legs trembled after the first 1,000 feet. Her ascender technique was clumsy, requiring Chewang and Ngawang Chuldim to position themselves above and below her on the rope, essentially guiding her body upward through the steepest sections. She reached Camp 3 after 7.5 hours, nearly double the time of the strongest climbers in the expedition, and arrived unable to eat, barely able to speak, her oxygen saturation registering numbers that made Chewang's expression tighten. That evening, Chewang radioed the expedition leader and recommended that Victoria not continue beyond Camp 3. His assessment was direct. Her pace was unsustainable for a summit attempt. Her oxygen consumption was too high, and her physical reserves were insufficient for the demands above 26,000 feet. The recommendation was relayed to Victoria. She refused. She had paid for a summit attempt, and she expected to receive one. She asked the expedition leader whether Chewang could be replaced with someone more supportive of her goals, and I want you to let that sink in for a second, because that part just infuriated me beyond belief when I read it. The question carried the weight of $500,000, enough to fund the operator's entire season. The expedition leader did not replace Chifeng, but he did not support Chifeng's recommendation either. Instead, he offered a compromise. The team would continue to Camp 4 on the South Col, assess Victoria's condition there, and make a final decision about the summit push based on how she responded to the altitude. Chewang accepted the compromise. He did not agree with it. When I found this detail buried in the reports, it just genuinely pushed me over the edge. I have to admit, this is one of the most infuriating stories I've ever had to research on this channel. The push from Camp 3 to Camp 4 revealed the full extent of the problem. Victoria required supplemental oxygen starting at Camp 3, a full camp earlier than the standard protocol, which reserved bottled oxygen for Camp 4 and above. The early start burned through reserves that had been calculated for the summit push. Chewang adjusted the oxygen plan and radioed base camp, requesting additional bottles be carried up by a support team. The request was fulfilled within 12 hours, but the margin that separated a manageable summit attempt from a crisis had narrowed to almost nothing. I remember reading this part and thinking, the crisis isn't coming, it's already here, they just haven't named it yet. Camp 4 on the South Col sat at 26,000 feet on a windswept plateau, littered with the debris of decades of expeditions. Abandoned oxygen bottles, shredded tents, frozen waste, and the occasional shape too still to be anything but human remains. The wind was a constant presence, moderate that evening at around 20 miles per hour, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Victoria arrived at Camp 4 in the early afternoon, supported by all 3 Sherpas for the final hour of climbing. She could not set up her own tent. She could not prepare her own equipment. And that right there told me everything I needed to know. Pemba Thendu managed her oxygen, food, and hydration while she lay in her sleeping bag, her body announcing with every labored breath that it had reached a threshold the money could not push past. The expedition doctor at base camp reviewed her vitals via satellite, heart rate elevated, oxygen saturation dangerously low, even on supplemental flow, reported symptoms consistent with early-stage altitude illness. His recommendation was clear: descend immediately. Victoria received the recommendation via radio and rejected it. A doctor, an actual medical professional monitoring her vitals in real time, told her to come down, and she said no. I still can't wrap my head around that. She stated that she felt better than the numbers suggested, and that she would rest and reassess before the summit push, scheduled for that night. Chewang made one more attempt. He told the expedition leader directly, not through suggestion, not through diplomatic framing, that Victoria should not attempt the summit. Her pace would require her to spend over 14 hours above 26,000 feet. Her oxygen consumption would exceed the supply they carried. The math was simple, and the conclusion was unavoidable. The expedition leader relayed the message. Victoria's response was that she had paid for 3 Sherpas, extra oxygen, and a summit attempt. And she intended to use all of them. And honestly, my frustration just doubles every time I read this part in the articles. But the expedition leader did not override her decision. The summit push began at midnight. The sky was clear, the wind moderate, the temperature approximately minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Victoria departed Camp 4 on supplemental oxygen with all 3 Sherpas. Other teams were already on the route above, headlamps visible on the triangular face in a line that stretched toward the balcony. Within the first hour, the problem was visible to anyone watching. Victoria's pace was roughly half the speed of the teams ahead of her. Climbers who had departed after her began passing, a stream of headlamps moving up the fixed ropes while her light barely seemed to change position. One climber from another expedition later recalled glancing back during a rest stop and seeing a single headlamp far below, barely moving, surrounded by 3 others clustered around it. He assumed it was a rescue. It wasn't. It was a summit attempt. When I read that account, it told me everything about how far outside normal this climb had become. Chewang maintained a steady presence beside her, adjusting her pace, monitoring her oxygen flow, watching for the signs he had been trained to recognize. They reached the balcony at 27,600 feet at approximately 5:15 a.m., over 5 hours after departure, roughly 90 minutes slower than the slowest safe pace for a summit attempt. The sun was beginning to light the horizon. Other teams that had departed at the same time were already approaching the south summit. Chewang recommended turning around. The pace was unsustainable. The oxygen consumption at this rate would exhaust their supply before they could complete the descent. Victoria refused. She could see headlamps above. She could see the ridge stretching toward the summit. She was not going back. I need you to understand. This is the 3rd time someone with more experience told her to stop, and 3 times, money won. Above the balcony, the deterioration accelerated. Every 100 feet of elevation required extended rest. Victoria's legs trembled with the effort of supporting her weight on the steep terrain. Ngawang Chuldim and Pemba Thendu took turns supporting her physically, holding her arm to prevent stumbles, positioning her crampons on the fixed rope, carrying her pack to reduce the load on her failing body. The 3 Sherpas rotated through these roles with practiced coordination, but the effort at this altitude was crushing. Each of them was burning oxygen and energy at rates their own bodies could not sustain indefinitely. They reached the south summit at approximately 10:30 a.m., and from the pictures I saw, the view really was extraordinary. The summit pyramid visible above, the Himalayan panorama spreading in every direction under a clear sky. Most teams had already summited and begun descending. The route above was nearly empty. Chewang calculated the remaining oxygen. At Victoria's consumption rate, they had approximately 3 hours of supply. The summit was 1 to 2 hours above them. The descent from the summit back to the South Col took a minimum of 4 to 5 hours for a strong climber. For Victoria, it would take significantly longer. The arithmetic was not ambiguous. Continuing meant running out of oxygen on the descent. He communicated this to Victoria and to the expedition leader via radio. His recommendation was immediate retreat. Victoria's response was that she could see the summit. She had come too far. She told the expedition leader that if Chewang would not take her up, she would unclip and continue alone. Believe me, this is the moment everything changes. I'm warning you now. The rest of the story will be tough to watch. The expedition leader, caught between the Sherpa's judgment and the client's money, instructed Chewang to continue, but to enforce a hard turnaround at 1 p.m., regardless of position. Chewang received the instruction. He did not agree with it, but the alternative, allowing Victoria to continue alone, would almost certainly result in her death within hours. At least with him beside her, there was a chance. And much to my horror, they continued. The climbing above the south summit crossed the narrow cornice ridge and rose toward the Hillary Step, a near vertical pitch of rock and ice that represented the final technical barrier before the summit. Victoria took over 45 minutes to clear the step, her movement slow and mechanical, her crampons scraping on rock rather than biting with precision. Chewang guided her through every move. By the time she reached the summit ridge, it was past noon. The ridge was a narrow spine of snow, with thousands of feet of exposure falling away on both sides into Tibet and Nepal. The wind had increased slightly, but remained manageable. The summit itself was empty. Victoria Ashworth reached the summit of Mount Everest at 12:47 p.m. on a clear afternoon. She stood at 29,032 feet, while Pemba Thendu took photographs, and she recorded video messages on her satellite device. She spent 11 minutes on the summit. Chewang urged her to begin descending immediately. She asked for more time to capture content. He took her arm and physically turned her toward the descent route. I had to reread that part at least 10 times. Content was still her priority. At 29,000 feet, with oxygen running out, they began descending at approximately 12:58 p.m., already past the 1 p.m. deadline, before they had taken 10 steps downward. The descent from the summit was slow. Victoria moved with the mechanical caution of someone whose body was operating on the last reserves of energy and oxygen her system could provide. Her first oxygen bottle emptied before they reached the south summit. Pemba Thendu switched her to a fresh bottle, one of the last two remaining for the entire 4-person team. The exchange was quick, but every second at this altitude without supplemental flow meant cellular damage accumulating in her brain and muscles. Below the south summit, Victoria's coordination began failing in ways the Sherpas recognized immediately. Her steps became uneven, her crampon placements imprecise. She stopped frequently without awareness that she had stopped, standing motionless on the fixed rope until Chewang touched her shoulder and prompted her forward. Her responses to questions arrived several seconds late. Her words slurred and disconnected. Many frequent viewers of this channel must already recognize these horrifying symptoms. By 3 p.m., they were still above the balcony, a position they should have reached an hour earlier. Victoria's second bottle was running low. Chewang made the decision that defined the rest of the descent. He removed his own oxygen mask and fitted his bottle onto Victoria's regulator. The exchange left him without supplemental oxygen at approximately 27,800 feet after a full summit day. He had operated without oxygen at altitude before, briefly during rescues, but never after 14 hours of continuous effort above 26,000 feet. This man gave away his own ability to breathe so she could have a few more hours. I don't have words for that kind of sacrifice. The descent continued. Victoria could no longer walk without being held upright. Her weight pressed down on the Sherpas who flanked her with every step, their bodies absorbing forces that the terrain and altitude amplified beyond what the human frame was designed to handle. At approximately 27,200 feet, on a steep section of fixed rope angled across hard ice, Ngawang Chuldim's right knee buckled. The joint bearing Victoria's weight in addition to his own on a surface that demanded precise foot placement failed with a sensation he would later describe as something inside simply disconnecting. He collapsed onto the rope. Victoria fell with him, her harness catching on the fixed line as her body went limp. Pemba Thendu lunged forward and grabbed her pack strap before momentum could carry both bodies down the face. And to be honest, my hands were shaking when I read that part of the report. Chewang now faced the calculation that every high-altitude guide dreads. One client who could not walk and one team member who could not support weight. He radioed base camp. The response confirmed what he already knew. No rescue team could reach them before morning. They were above 27,000 feet, in darkness that was falling fast, and entirely on their own. I've spent years covering mountain disasters on this channel, and the moments that haunt me most are always the ones where good people run out of options because someone else burned through all of them. Victoria stopped responding to commands. Her breathing became shallow and irregular, each inhalation producing less effect than the last, her body's systems cascading toward failure. Her eyes remained open but did not track movement or respond to light. The presentation was consistent with advanced high-altitude cerebral edema, her brain swelling beyond the point where consciousness could be maintained, pushed past every threshold by a day that should never have begun. Victoria Ashworth died on the fixed ropes at approximately 27,000 feet on the southeast ridge of Mount Everest. The exact time was not recorded. The mountain did not care about the $500,000 she had paid, the sponsors who were watching, or the charity pledges that depended on her summit. It cared only about the physics of oxygen, altitude, and the limits of the human body. Limits that 4 warnings had tried to enforce and that money had overridden every time, and I hope that line sits with you the way it sat with me. Chiwang and Pemba Thendu, supporting the injured Ngawang Chuldim between them, descended toward Camp 4 through darkness. They arrived after midnight, frostbitten, depleted, and carrying the weight of a death they had tried 4 separate times to prevent. Victoria's body remains on the southeast ridge. Recovery was deemed too dangerous. Ngawang Chuldim underwent knee surgery in Kathmandu, torn ligaments and cartilage damage sustained while bearing a client's weight on steep ice at extreme altitude. At 29, his guiding career was over, which honestly just shatters my heart. Chewang Dorje Lama returned to guiding the following season, but colleagues noted something had shifted. He was quieter, more cautious, more willing to refuse assignments that carried warning signs. He had done everything right on that mountain: warned, recommended, calculated, adjusted, sacrificed his own oxygen. And none of it had mattered. The money had spoken louder than the mountain, right up until the moment the mountain stopped listening. If I ever had to give an example for why money doesn't buy happiness, this story would be my pick.